Was Israel's tabernacle, a sacred tent where Yahweh dwelt during the 40-year wilderness journey, a real divinely inspired sanctuary, or was it instead a legendary fabrication derived from the ancient Near Eastern cultures of Egypt, Canaan, and Mesopotamia? From Ugaritic texts of gods in tents to Egyptian pharaohs' battle shrines, in this video we uncover shocking parallels and try to determine an answer to the question, did Israel borrow from its neighbors and predecessors in order to forge a sacred story? The story is well known. According to the Old Testament, at the hands of Yahweh and his prophet Moses, the Israelites were freed from their enslavement in Egypt. After crossing the Red Sea miraculously, the Israelites were led to Mount Sinai, where Yahweh handed down his law and 10 commandments to the Israelites through Moses. Contained within the many laws and statutes given to the Israelites was one peculiar set of divine instructions for the construction of a tabernacle, in the Hebrew known as a Mishkan, that would function as a portable sanctuary wherein Yahweh would dwell. Exodus chapter 25 verses 8 through 9 lays this out as Yahweh commands, "And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst." Exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all of its furniture, so you shall make it. Detailed instructions follow in Exodus chapter 26, outlining a tent with curtains, poles, and a holy of holies for the Ark of the Covenant, where Yahweh's presence manifests as a cloud and fire. Now, in this present discussion, we'll ignore the seemingly absurd implications of a supposed divine and immaterial God desiring a physical place to dwell, and instead focus on a different issue, namely, the fact that this notion of a divine dwelling place or tabernacle is likely a legendary outgrowth that derives largely from Israel's ancient Near Eastern neighbors and forebears. You see, Israel was not in fact unique in their belief in a portable tent shrine that could house their specific god during nomadic instances. The concept of a deity dwelling in a tent or portable shrine is pervasive across ancient Near Eastern cultures that both predated and surrounded Israel. In Canaanite literature, the Ugaritic texts stemming from the 14th to 13th century BCE depict El, the chief Canaanite god, residing in a tent. The Baal cycle articulates many instances of El's abode. Asherah came to El's mountain and entered the tent of the king, the father of years. In the translation and commentary on the Ugaritic Baal cycle, authors Mark Smith and Wayne Pittard state, El is portrayed in the Baal cycle as living in a tent rather than a solid palace. The structure of the tent is such that there are 7 chambers, the innermost being where El dwells. This mirrors the tabernacle of Yahweh, which has 2 chambers, one being the Holy of Holies, where Yahweh could be said to dwell. In fact, even the Hebrew word ohel, which means tent, linguistically mirrors the Ugaritic word for tent, while the Hebrew word for tabernacle or dwelling place, mishkan, is mirrored in the Ugaritic word, which also refers to a dwelling place. This suggests a shared linguistic and conceptual root, which only strengthens the notion that Israel derived this concept from their Canaanite predecessors. Biblical scholar Mark Smith, whose commentary on the Ugaritic Baal cycle we just surveyed, in his book, The Origins of Biblical Monotheism, states, "The tent of meeting in the Israelite tradition echoes the Ugaritic depictions of El's tent, where the high god of the Canaanite pantheon holds court. The biblical Ohel Moed, tent of meeting, and the Ugaritic Al share a conceptual framework where the deity resides in a tented space to meet with and guide the community, suggesting Israel's tabernacle practice drew from a Canaanite prototype reimagined for Yahweh's exclusive worship." The late Michael Homan, a professor of theology, in his book, To Your Tents, O Israel, the terminology, function, form, and symbolism of tents in the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East, echoes Smith's sentiments when he states, "The tabernacle of the Hebrew Bible shares striking similarities with tent shrines of the ancient Near East, particularly in its portability and role as a divine dwelling. This suggests Israel adapted a widespread Canaanite tradition of mobile sanctuaries to house the divine presence, aligning Yahweh with the regional concept of a deity who travels with his people. Yet, even though through the historical and archaeological records Israel bears closest resemblance to Canaanite culture, the Canaanite literature of the Ugaritic text is not the only place where we encounter parallels to Israel's shrine of divine dwelling. Mesopotamian traditions also feature portable divine spaces. While gods like Marduk typically resided in temples, military campaigns involved carrying divine images in tent-like structures or palanquins. The Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation epic, hints at such mobility, with gods accompanying warriors, much like the Ark of the Covenant led Israel in battle in Numbers chapter 10. The late biblical scholar Victor Hurowitz, in his book I Have Built You an Exalted House, states, "The biblical description of the tabernacle's construction in Exodus chapters 25 through 31 and 35 through 40 parallels ancient Near Eastern accounts of divine sanctuaries, such as the tent shrines used by Mesopotamian and Northwest Semitic peoples during military campaigns. The emphasis on divine blueprints, as seen in Yahweh's instructions to Moses, mirrors Mesopotamian traditions where gods like A or Marduk provide plans for sacred spaces, indicating a shared cultural pattern of divine authorization for ritual structures. So, just as in the narrative in Exodus, Yahweh instructs the Israelites regarding the specificities of his tent, the Mesopotamian texts often depict gods like Marduk authorizing sacred spaces, suggesting a borrowed cultural concept of divine guidance for the idea of Israel's tabernacle. The parallels don't end with the Canaanites and Mesopotamians. The Egyptians, during the latter half of the 2nd millennium BCE, also fashioned their own portable shrines to invoke divine protection, guidance, and favor for the pharaoh and his army during battle or during travel. Egyptians believed gods like Amun-Ra, the chief deity, accompanied the army to ensure victory. The shrine housed a statue or symbol, for example a staff or small idol, representing the god, allowing the deity to travel with the troops and be consulted via oracles or rituals. Now, according to the biblical narrative, the Israelite tabernacle was never brought into battle. However, the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred element housed within the tabernacle's Holy of Holies, was occasionally mobilized in military contexts, symbolizing Yahweh's presence and power. In the conquest of Jericho in the book of Joshua, and in the battle with the Philistines in 1 Samuel, the Ark of the Covenant is brought into battle to elicit divine power sought for triumph. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4, Yahweh is said to sit enthroned on the cherubim. So we see here that the Ark of the Covenant of the Israelites, which is part of the tabernacle, closely mirrors the Egyptian battle shrines. Now, conservative biblical scholars have no doubt surveyed these cultural parallels. How do they explain the pervasive ancient Near Eastern phenomenon of portable divine tents and shrines that appear to call into question the historicity of the biblical narrative? The late conservative biblical scholar and Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, in his book On the Reliability of the Old Testament, states, "The tabernacle's structure and portability find parallels in Egyptian military tents of the 13th century BC, as at Kadesh under Ramses II, but this does not mean Israel copied them. A tent for divine presence fits the nomadic needs of the Exodus, and Exodus chapters 25 through 31 insists the pattern came from Yahweh himself." First, claiming that a tent for the divine presence fits the nomadic needs of the Exodus already assumes something quite strange, namely that Yahweh felt the need to be in some sense physically or adjacently present to the Israelites in a limited and superstitious manner. It seems a bit odd that the supposed transcendent creator of the universe would desire to manifest and concentrate his presence in such a primitive manner, especially in a manner that mirrored the superstitions of the ancient Near East. Second, Kitchen acknowledges that the biblical narrative is mirrored in Egyptian practices, but merely sweeps this under the rug and affirms that the narrative is historical because the book of Exodus insists that Yahweh himself is the source of the instructions. Yet this is simply textbook question begging. The narrative must trace back to Yahweh because the narrative says it does? Kitchen will have to forgive those of us who don't find this convincing. Old Testament scholar Walter Kaiser Jr. mirrors Kitchen's poor argumentation in his book The Promised Plan of God. He states, "The tent of meeting shares a cultural backdrop with Ugaritic and Mesopotamian tent shrines, but its blueprint in Exodus 25 through 40 is divinely given, not borrowed." In line with Kitchen, Kaiser Jr. seems to be just declaring by fiat that Israel's instructions for the tabernacle come from Yahweh, instead of simply being part of the cultural milieu. This, again, isn't the least bit compelling, but worse than that, it's just not a sound argument. We already surveyed the fact that the blueprints for the divine tent of the Babylonians were supposedly guided by Marduk. If we take Kitchen and Kaiser Jr.'s argument seriously that Yahweh handed down the blueprints for his tabernacle, then we ought to seriously consider the veracity of the Babylonian story as well. To argue otherwise is special pleading. Other apologetic maneuvers involve arguing that although Yahweh's tabernacle is paralleled in a multitude of ancient Near Eastern cultures, the former is not identical to the latter, and, despite cultural similarities, the biblical narrative is grounded in unique theology. Now, this is indeed true. The biblical narrative is not identical to the Ugaritic or Mesopotamian texts, and the Yahwistic theology is assuredly unique compared to the Egyptians. For instance, Yahweh's tabernacle made no use of divine iconography or idols, in contrast with its ancient Near Eastern neighbors. But this doesn't exactly amount to a whole lot. First, every ancient Near Eastern culture was unique in some sense. If Canaanite theology wasn't unique compared to Egyptian theology, then there would be no distinction between them at all. Now, granted, the theology of ancient Near Eastern cultures diverged from each other in varying degrees, with Israelite culture plausibly diverging the most. Nevertheless, Israelite culture remains perfectly embedded within the cultural zeitgeist of its time. Examples such as the divine tabernacle demonstrate that while Israel must have given its own theological spin to the practices of its neighbors and forebears, their practices and theology still largely derived from and were rooted in the preceding and surrounding cultures of their time. Biblical scholar William Dever articulates this point well in his book Did God Have a Wife?, where he states, "Apologists argue the tabernacle's covenantal role sets it apart, but archaeology and texts show portable shrines were standard. Egyptian barks, Ugaritic tents for El, Hittite campaign sanctuaries. The divine command of Exodus 25, 8-9 echoes Near Eastern rhetoric, not a sui generis event. Israel's cult borrowed forms, materials, and ideas, reworking them over time. Claims of radical uniqueness are theological, not historical." The inferences of our small study of cultural anthropology in the ancient Near East seem firm. The dwelling place of Yahweh, as depicted in Exodus and Numbers, is more plausibly a legendary fabrication than a historical fact, derived and adapted from the ancient Near Eastern practices of Israel's neighbors and forebears. The tabernacle, with its borrowed structure, symbolism, and function, and the biblical narrative of its genesis in divine mandates from Yahweh, emerges as a crafted myth, rooted in the rich cultic tapestry of the ancient Near East, reshaped to forge Israel's sacred story. Thanks for watching.